All right, so tonight we can begin our program. So tonight we welcome back a great friend to our roundtable and Wheaton resident where he grew up. Also a past winner of our Nevins-Freeman Award in 2012. Will started his career at the National Park Service, and then he became the first director of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which is now the American Battlefield Trust. And after that, Will went to Pamplin Park, where he was the founding director. And I think one of the big thrills of all the tours that we've been on, especially for me, is when Will took us around Pamplin Park and the Petersburg area. And I think one of my favorite all-time things I've ever seen anywhere is in Petersburg, the Blandford Church. I still think of all the places that we've gone, that's one of the more memorable or touching places of Civil War preservation and memory. And after now, Will's super busy working on his 3-volume The Petersburg Campaign. Is the first book's already out, Campaign of Giants, and 2 more are coming. But tonight, we're going to be talking about the Chattanooga campaign, and we're going to be talking about opening the Cracker Line. So tonight, please give us a warm welcome to Will Greene. Thanks, man.
Well, Liz gave my talk, and the book raffle took up all my time, so and the Predators were playing the Blackhawks on TV, so I had a good evening. Well, what a pleasure it is to be back. I feel like this is a homecoming for me, and so many people out here that I really like, old friends. Larry Strickland, good to see Larry again. Larry Hewitt, my graduate school compadre at LSU. Good to see Tom again. Kurt Carlson. And John Horn. I met John for the first time. John and I are in a small fraternity of people interested in Petersburg. So it's good to meet John, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank Mark and especially Rob Girardi, who has been just a prince, squiring me around Chicago. We went to Pullman, we went down to the cemetery where the Confederate group is, and we went to Douglas's statue in Camp Douglas site. And Rob, thank you so much for everything you did for me. Well, I live in the Chattanooga area now, and although most of my writing has been on Eastern theater things, tonight, as Brian said, I want to talk about an aspect of the Chattanooga campaign that I think is overlooked a great deal. And my thesis is that these 2 very minor actions at Browns Ferry and Wauhatchie in October 1863 were the real decisive actions in the Chattanooga campaign. Now, when you think about Chattanooga, what comes to mind?
Missionary Ridge.
Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain, right? Everybody concentrates on those things. But these 2 small actions that occurred in late October of 1863 should have rendered the battles of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge unnecessary. So here's my talk, and it really involves complicated geography. I'll spend a little time trying to refamiliarize. I know this is a very erudite group, and I mean that sincerely. You all know a lot about this, but reacquaint you with this geography, a daring plan, and some frankly god-awful generation. So let's see if Bruce and I have been able to work this. Yes, we have. Here's the geography around Chattanooga. Now, we all know that the Federal Army gets defeated at Chickamauga on September 20th, retreats into Chattanooga after losing 16,000 men at Chickamauga, and they establish a defensive line around Chattanooga, represented by that dotted line. It's about 3 miles anchored on each flank on the Tennessee River. The Confederate Army, of course, is victorious at Chickamauga, but they lose 18,000 men, and they are slow to pursue and frankly in no real position to try to administer the coup de grace on the Army of the Cumberland. So instead, they take up positions east of the city on Missionary Ridge, on the valley between Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, which is called the Chattanooga Valley. And then, of course, on Lookout Mountain and to the west of Lookout Mountain, the area known as the Lookout Valley. And the entire premise behind these positions is that Braxton Bragg's army is going to starve the Federals out of Chattanooga. That is the strategy for the Confederates. Now, Bragg's intelligence indicated that the Union commander, William Stark Rosecrans, was very likely to abandon the city. And frankly, Rosecrans's correspondence, communications with Washington, as well as the communications sent to the War Department by the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Anderson Dana, who had been sent to the Army of the Cumberland to spy on Rosecrans, gave every indication that Rosecrans was going to capitulate. One of Dana's correspondents called Rosecrans dazed and hazy. And one of Rosecrans's correspondents back to Washington said that we are about 30,000 brave and determined men, but our fate is in the hands of God, in whom I hope. And of course, the War Department much preferred that the fate of the army be in the hands of the commanding general and not the deity. Now, Rosecrans did call for reinforcements, and as was mentioned in the quiz, those reinforcements traveled 1,159 miles by rail, one of the more spectacular logistical accomplishments of the Civil War. And these were divisions of the 11th and 12th Corps, and of course, Joe Hooker was the commander there. All right, now, the Confederates controlled the direct route into Chattanooga from the Union supply base. Now, the Union supply base was on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, which worked its way through a tunnel, through the Cumberland Plateau, and emerged out at Bridgeport, Alabama, on the banks of the Tennessee River. The road leading from Bridgeport into Chattanooga was, of course, impractical because the Confederates were in Lookout Valley, so they couldn't use the road. The Tennessee River was low. Many of you remember that Chickamauga was fought during a drought, and the river was too low to sustain steamboat traffic, particularly through the area near Chattanooga. So the river was out. The Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad was also infeasible because the Confederates had destroyed the bridge over the Tennessee River at Bridgeport and also the bridge over Running Water Creek. And if any of you have traveled, most of you probably have been to Chattanooga, traveled on I-24 coming from Nashville into Chattanooga, you might remember a huge elevated railroad bridge. It's way up over the interstate. That's over Running Water Creek. I have a photograph of the Civil War bridge later in the presentation. Now, there was a fourth possible way to get into Chattanooga. There was a road called Haley's Trace. It was a primitive road, but it hugged the banks of the Tennessee River on the north side as it got near Chattanooga, and the Confederate pickets on the south bank of the river could easily shoot the horses and mules pulling the supply wagons, and consequently, Haley's Trace was not an option. That left only one way to get supplies into Chattanooga, and that was to take wagons on a torturous 60-mile-long trek from Bridgeport up the Wauhatchie Valley. It's a beautiful, narrow little valley between Walden's Ridge on the east and the Cumberland Plateau on the west. Get to a very primitive road called Anderson Turnpike, the Anderson Pike, snake their way up steep Walden's Ridge, across the plateau, and back down the steep east side of the ridge, and eventually over the pontoon bridge leading into Chattanooga. And that was a very difficult trek. Colonel Benjamin Scribner of the 38th Indiana wrote that the ridge is steep and crooked. The road, much of the way, is composed of logs, one end of which rests on the side of the mountain. The other end supported in a horizontal position by props, thus forming a sort of corduroy road. At one point near the summit, a stream of water runs down the mountainside through the logs. It was a rickety, insecure makeshift of a road and was so narrow that only in a couple of places could two teams pass. Now, the modern version of the Anderson Pike, I live about 100 feet from the Anderson Pike, and as it goes down the mountain on the east side, the road is called the W because of the hairpin turns. And I'll tell you, half the people in Chattanooga will not drive the W because it's such a hazardous road, and that's in 2024. Now, the drought got broken on October 1st, and the road turned into a sea of mud. Mules were mired up to their bellies, wagons were stuck up to their hubs, and it made the trek across Walden's Ridge just torturous. It would take 2 weeks to make a round trip once it started to rain. And to make matters even worse, on October the 3rd, Joe Wheeler's cavalry launched a big raid into the Wauhatchie Valley and destroyed 500 of Rosecrans' wagons. As a result of this semi-siege, rations were cut to half and then down to a quarter. And the Federal Army, as one soldier said, was about to starve. The possibility, he said, of being starved out stared us in the face. So bad had the situation become that guards had to be posted over the corrals where the horses and mules were being fed the few ears of corn that were available, because the soldiers would steal that in order to get something to eat. Never in the history of the Army of the Cumberland had the spirit of its officers and men been more depressed, wrote one officer. The Battle of Chickamauga had not only been fought and lost, but we also lost what was more than losing the battle. We have lost confidence in our commander. Now, what about the Confederate Army? Of course, Braxton Bragg is the commander, and there are internal and external forces that are impeding the efficiency of the Army of Tennessee. As most of you know, Bragg had a tempestuous relationship with most of his senior commanders. Jefferson Davis came down to Chattanooga. The situation had become so bad. The president came down to referee these disputes. He called a meeting. This is a terrible thing to do if you're a CEO and you have subordinates that aren't getting along. He has all of the generals and Bragg in a meeting, and he asked the generals to tell him what they thought of Bragg in Bragg's presence. And most of them said respectfully that they felt that Bragg should be replaced. But as you know, Davis sustained his friend Braxton Bragg, and then Braxton Bragg went about the business of purging the army of the malcontents. But he could not get rid of two of them. Two of his detractors. One was Simon Butler, and the most important of his detractors was James Longstreet. Longstreet was about untouchable. After all, he had played a pivotal role in the victory at Chickamauga, and he was Lee's senior commander. And Longstreet was beyond Bragg's reach. And what happened is Longstreet ignored Bragg, and Bragg pretty much ignored Longstreet. Moreover, the supply line feeding the Confederates coming up on the single-track Western and Atlantic Railroad from Atlanta was also pretty rickety, and the Confederates were suffering from a lack of supplies. The famous memoirist, Sam Watkins, wrote that never in my life do I remember experiencing so much oppression and humiliation. The soldiers were starved and almost naked and covered over with lice and camp itch and filth and dirt. The men looked sick, hollow-eyed, and heartbroken, living principally upon parched corn, which had been picked up out of the mud and dirt under the feet of the officers' horses. We thought of nothing, said Watkins, but starvation. So, both armies have got their problems on the eve of these actions, but Rosecrans' defeat at Chickamauga meant that he was bound to be replaced. But the Lincoln administration kept Rosecrans in command until the election for governor of Ohio had been resolved, because Rosecrans was a Democrat, and the administration felt that removing this popular Democrat from command would help the Democratic candidate in Ohio, who was none other than Clement Vallandigham, which of course was anathema to the Lincoln administration. And so after the Republican candidate John Raw was elected, that Rosecrans was out. And Abraham Lincoln creates the military division of the Mississippi, and of course, as we all know, he names Ulysses S. Grant as commander of his, not only his own army of the Tennessee, but Burnside's army of the Ohio, and Rosecrans' army of the Cumberland. And the War Department orders allow Grant the discretion of keeping Rosecrans or replacing him. And that was about as difficult a decision as picking Charles Barkley for a pickup basketball game. Because Rosecrans and Grant, as most of you know, did not get along. So it was easy to say no Rosecrans, and Grant names, of course, George Thomas to command the army. And as we learned from the quiz, when Grant informed Thomas that he was in command, he is said to have remarked, "I will hold the town until we starve." Although most people don't realize that Thomas was something of a Rosecrans partisan. He was not all that happy about Rosecrans being removed, but nevertheless, he is now in command. Grant arrives at Stevenson, Alabama. That's not on the map that I showed you. Stevenson's just about 5 miles up the railroad from Bridgeport. That was sort of one of the supply bases for the Union Army. He arrives there on the 21st and meets with Rosecrans at a house called Little Brick. It's gone now, but the site is there and marked in Stevenson. And he learns of the plan to end the semi-siege of Chattanooga from Rosecrans. And Grant will comment that the only question he has is, why didn't Rosecrans execute the plan? Because he thought it sounded like a good one. And as we learned, William Farrar Smith, Baldy Smith, had become the chief engineer of the Army of the Cumberland on September 30th. And he and Rosecrans together devised this plan to let's lift the siege. So Grant comes into Chattanooga, meets with Thomas on the 23rd, asks Smith to come in and explain the plan in detail. Smith does this, and Grant thinks it sounds pretty good. What is the plan? All that rain that made the Anderson Pike so difficult to traverse had raised the water level in the Tennessee River such that steamboats could then operate. And to Rosecrans' credit, he had spent the intervening month between Chickamauga and mid-October building crude steamboats at Bridgeport that would be capable of ferrying supplies up the river to Chattanooga. So the river is now navigable. And the idea is to put the supplies onto the steamboats, take them 22 river miles to a place called Kelly's Ferry. At Kelly's Ferry, there was a good road that ran 6 miles through Cummings Gap between Sand Mountain and Raccoon Mountain that wound its way to another landing on the Tennessee River called Brown's Ferry. And if a pontoon bridge could be built at Brown's Ferry, connecting the south bank of the river with Moccasin Point, it was only then a 3-mile wagon haul to the pontoon bridge leading into Chattanooga. So this would reduce a 60-mile wagon haul across this god-awful road to 9 miles on good roads. But of course, the problem is, how are you going to build a pontoon bridge? Because the Confederates are right there. And how are you going to hold off the Confederates, who no doubt will try to redeem the situation there? And the plan was to put a brigade of federal troops into pontoon boats. Thomas had built pontoon boats, rectangular craft that was really never meant to transport people. Could accommodate about 25 men per boat. He had those pontoon boats built. And he would put a brigade in those pontoon boats, float them the 9 miles from Chattanooga down to Browns Ferry, use the pontoon boats to make an amphibious landing, drive away the Confederate guards, and then have the pontoon boats create a bridge. And that was the plan. So Grant, Smith, and Thomas ride out to Browns Ferry on October 24th. They look over the situation, and as I mentioned last night to the group in Milwaukee, if you haven't been to Chattanooga in the last 7 or 8 years, you probably have not been to Browns Ferry. But in that last half dozen years or so, the Park Service has created a pathway, about a half-mile pathway that will take you to the Union side of the river, right at Browns Ferry. And also, the American Battlefield Trust has acquired the land on the Confederate side of the river. So now Browns Ferry on both sides is accessible, and it's quite a wonderful historic scene. One of the reasons Smith picked Browns Ferry is that there were 2 hills on the south bank of the river that he said, hey, listen, if we fortify those 2 hills, it's going to be hard to drive us away. Those 2 hills they're right there when you stand at Browns Ferry. So Grant looks this over and said, hey, this looks like a plan. But of course, the Confederates, the river there is just like it was in 1863. You know, most of the Tennessee River has been dammed and lakes created by the TVA, but that part of the river is still 300 yards wide like it was in 1863. And the Confederate pickets are right on the other side of the river in clear view. Grant said they did not fire upon us nor seem disturbed by our presence. They must have seen that we were all commissioned officers, but I suppose they looked upon the garrison of Chattanooga as prisoners of war and thought it would be inhumane to kill us, except in self-defense. Well, Grant says, let's do it. He names October 27th as the date to go forward. And in typical Grant fashion, he delegates the details of executing the plan to General Thomas. And Thomas turns to one of his best brigade commanders, William B. Hazen, to provide the troops that would be in those pontoon boats. And Hazen is really a fine commander, a very good commander. And he knows everybody in his brigade, and he handpicks all the officers and non-commissioned officers, the best and the bravest of his brigade, to be responsible for this maneuver. He can only fit about 1,400 men of his brigade in the boats, so the rest of them are going to be marching across Moccasin Point under the command of the infamous Russian Ivan Turchinov, better known as John B. Turchin. And he will have the rest of Hazen's men and all of his brigade hiding in the woods on Moccasin Point, waiting for the bridge to be accomplished. Okay, there were 50 pontoon boats and 2 flat boats that are accommodating 40 or 50 men apiece. And Hazen's men were up at midnight, October 27th, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, they pushed off down the Tennessee River. Now imagine this: it's dark, and the Confederates for 7 of those 9 river miles are opposite them, 300 yards away. And you talk about a nervous time. A fellow named William Morgan, who was lieutenant in the 23rd Kentucky, remembered that about 3 o'clock, the boats started following a large flatboat. My squad, he says, is the last boat. So far as I know, the only instructions imparted to the commanders of the squad was that at the proper time, we would receive orders. The moon went down just before we started, and although a light fog fell, we were able to distinguish the preceding boat. One of my boys remarked, "This reminds me of a picture I once saw of Washington crossing the Alps." His mixed history caused a general laugh, which was quickly suppressed by a voice from the boat ahead of us in a kind of stage whisper. "Shut up, you damn fools! Do you think this is a regatta?" Now, Hazen says that at precisely 3 o'clock, the flotilla moved noiselessly out. I desired to reach the landing a little before daylight and soon learned that the current would enable me to do so without oars. After moving 3 miles, we came under the guns of the enemy's pickets, but keeping well under the opposite shore, were not discovered until the first boat was within 10 feet of the landing. Now, Hazen had ordered a bonfire to be prepared at exactly the point where Brown's Ferry would be, and told the man there that when he heard the boats approach to light that fire, that would indicate the time the boats would turn towards the opposite shore. All right, well, let's leave the Federals right there because let's talk a little bit about the Confederates who are involved in this. And as we heard earlier, the Confederate commander is James Longstreet. It's his troops that are on Lookout Mountain, to the east of Lookout Mountain and in the Lookout Valley. But Old Pete seemed insensible to any threat coming from the west. And it was not until Bragg insisted that he send troops out west of Lookout Mountain that he did so. And at that point, he only sent 1 brigade of Alabama troops out that way. As I mentioned, Longstreet did almost nothing to conceal his contempt for Braxton and Bragg. And Bragg gave Longstreet a wide berth. He didn't want to get involved with Longstreet. There were reports that reached Longstreet's headquarters that there was strange activity in Hooker's camps at Bridgeport and activity on Moccasin Point. Longstreet dismissed those reports, but instead felt that if Hooker was going to be moving towards him, he would be climbing Lookout Mountain at a place called Johnson's Crook, about 20 miles south of the point on Lookout Mountain. And then those Federals would move south to north on top of the mountain to attack Longstreet. That was his mindset. Now, not only do we have that problem with Longstreet and Bragg and Longstreet's confusion, but we also have problems with the division that is responsible for Lookout Mountain and the Lookout Valley. That division had been John Bell Hood's, but Hood was wounded at Chickamauga, as we all know, and Longstreet named one of his proteges, the young South Carolinian named Micah Jenkins, to lead the division. But this didn't sit well with the men and officers in that division who preferred their senior brigade commander, Evander Law, who, after all, was the one who replaced Hood at Gettysburg and at Chickamauga. And to make matters even worse, Law and Jenkins hated one another. They had both been cadets at the South Carolina Military Academy, today's Citadel. They clashed there. They both landed teaching positions at a military academy in Yorkville, South Carolina before the war. They clashed there. And so there was no love lost between Law and Jenkins. Now, Longstreet ignored Bragg's October 25th order to send reconnaissance out towards Bridgeport, again citing his fear that the Federals would attack him on top of Lookout Mountain. And Law's brigade was the only troops that he sent out west of the mountain. Now, anticipating no change in the status quo on October 25th, Law takes leave to visit Hood, who is recuperating in the Wauhatchie Valley about 30 miles south of Chattanooga in northwest Georgia, with the express purpose of lobbying Hood to be in favor of him taking over the division. While Law is gone, Jenkins decides that he's going to remove 3 of Law's 5 regiments to the east side of Lookout Mountain for reasons that are never really explained, leaving only the 4th Alabama and the 15th Alabama on the west side of the mountain under the command of William C. Oates, a little round top thing. So he has Longstreet has an entire division available to defend the west of Lookout Mountain, and he only has 2 small regiments there. Now, Law would write after the war that he thought that Jenkins did this intentionally to set him up for failure. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think Jenkins was complacent, and it was also a little bit of a problem supplying those Confederate forces west of the mountain. When Law returns on the 26th from his visit to Hood, he's outraged that 60% of his brigade has been shifted away from the mountain, and he orders those 3 regiments to go back to the west side, but they're going to be too late. Law wrote that the withdrawal of these troops without rhyme or reason, for there was no earthly necessity for them on the east side of Lookout, opened an easy way for the enemy to throw a force across the river into Lookout Valley, with a fair prospect of cutting off entirely the 2 regiments remaining there. Why this order was issued has always been a mystery to me. Okay, so that's the Confederate situation. Now it's about 4:30 in the morning. Pontoon boats are approaching Brown's Ferry. The bonfire is lit. Hazen shouts, "Pull in, pull across the river, head for the ridge, dig in." And the Federals, who are led by an officer from the 23rd Kentucky, make their amphibious landing here at Brown's Ferry. Now there's only a handful of pickets from Company B, 15th Alabama. There they fire a volley or 2 over the heads of the Federals and then retreat. Now Colonel Oates is on the ball and he recognizes the problem. He gathers about 150 men, were the only troops that were available to him, launches a counterattack. And for a few minutes, the outcome was in doubt, but there were more and more of Hazen's men landing, and Oates is wounded, and Law arrives too late, and he sees that there's almost all of Hazen's brigade has landed. Even some of Turchin's men have been ferried across the river. Law says this is too tough to attack. And the Federals capture Brown's Ferry with a loss of 4 killed and 17 wounded. Okay, so now with the engineers building the pontoon bridge, that was done by noon, and now there's that connection. So the only contingency left now is how are they going to hold that bridgehead? And of course, whose job is that? That's the job of Joe Hooker. Now, Grant had been urging Hooker to move as quickly as possible. Hooker dragged his feet a little bit because he didn't have his supply wagons there, but on October 27th in the morning, he starts out from Bridgeport. He's not all that enthusiastic about this plan. He thinks this is a little too risky, but he starts marching on the 27th. He has 3 divisions, as they said. The 11th Corps has the divisions under Adolf von Steinwehr and Karl Schurz. And on the night of the 27th, they make it as far as a little depot at Whiteside. The 12th Corps division was under John White Gary, and they camped that night behind them at Shell Mound. The next day, on October 28th, the 11th Corps troops make it all the way to a point about a mile south of Brown's Ferry and go into camp there. Geary's men trailing behind will march, and they will stop at a little railroad junction called Wauhatchie. There at Wauhatchie, a spur line of the M&C Railroad ran 20 miles south to Trenton, Georgia, while the main stem of the railroad went around the nose of Lookout Mountain and into Chattanooga. At Wauhatchie, Geary was in position to guard the road connecting Kelly's Ferry and Brown's Ferry, which of course is part of the Cracker Line. Now, Longstreet had completely dismissed the capture of Brown's Ferry. He thought that was just a diversion. He's still thinking that the Yankees are going to attack him on top of Lookout Mountain. So he ignores the capture of Brown's Ferry. But an officer on Missionary Ridge, St. John R. Liddell, here's the fighting, and he takes it on his own authority to ride over to Lookout Mountain to see what the heck is going on. Well, he sees the Yankees there in charge of Brown's Ferry, and he rides back and reports to Bragg what has happened. Bragg is furious and sends orders to Longstreet, by all means, drive those Federals away from Brown's Ferry. What does Longstreet do? He ignores it. He does respond and say, "Nah, don't worry about that, Bragg. I'm really worried about the Yankees coming up from Johnson's throat." Well, when Bragg gets this message, he's not sure what to believe, But he sends another message to Longstreet saying, if you are not attacked from the south tomorrow, you attack Brown's Ferry with everything you've got. On the 28th of October, the same day that the Federals are moving into Brown's Ferry and Wauhatchie, Longstreet decides to ride over and meet with Longstreet personally. That must have been a very tense meeting. They met at a place called Sunset Rock. Has anybody been to Sunset Rock? Arcas and Rob. It's part of the National Military Park. The view from there is stunning today. And you can see the entire Lookout Valley from Sunset Rock. And they stood out there on that rock and they watched Howard and Geary move into position. And of course, Bragg says to Longstreet, you attack these and you drive them out and you use your entire corps. And if you need a division from Breckinridge's corps, I'll give you a Breckinridge's corps. But you've got to drive these people away. He rides back to his headquarters in Missionary Ridge. Longstreet says, well, yeah, I don't think so. What I'll do, I'll attack, but I'm only going to use one division. I'm only going to use Jenkins. And I'm not going to attack Braxton. I'll just attack these guys at Wauhatchie instead. Now, Colonel Schurz recognized that this was not a really good deployment by the Federals. He says the enemy could easily observe every one of our movements. And it occurred to some of us that the separation by nearly 3 miles at Bad Road of Geary's small force from ours was really an invitation to attack under circumstances very favorable to the enemy. But such was the disposition made by General Hooker. Okay, so Longstreet's going to make his attack. The battle plan is this. He's going to attack at night. And that seems pretty irregular, but there were Federal artillery batteries on Moccasin Point. And Longstreet, I think, I'm pretty hard on old Pete here, but I think he's right in thinking that if I send my guys down that mountain in daylight, they're going to take pretty severe casualties from the Union artillery. So I'm going to send them down at night. Now, Law and Jerome Robertson, in charge of the Texas Brigade, are going to occupy a piece of ground between the 11th Corps deployment and Wauhatchie to prevent any of those 11 Corps fellows to aid Geary. Jenkins' own brigade, now commanded by John Bratton, is going to be responsible with his 1,600 men responsible for attacking Wauhatchie. And the 4th Brigade in the division, Henry Rock Benning's Georgia Brigade, would be in reserve, and their primary job would be to guard the single bridge across Lookout Creek, which was impassable except for that bridge. That would be the Confederates' escape route. So that is the plan. And Jenkins had the temerity to ask Law, his great rival, what he thought of the plan. And Law said, I told him plainly that as matters now stood, the Browns Ferry force and that of Hooker having united, their numbers amounted to at least 3 times our own, which rendered the success of the attack more than doubtful. And even if we gained a temporary success during the night, the light of the next morning would reveal our weakness with the force of the enemy on both sides of us. Each would be superior to our whole force. The chance of success may be calculated by anyone at all conversant with military affairs at 0. But despite Law's objections, Jenkins begins moving down the mountain. Now he halts about halfway down the mountain, waiting for Lafayette McLaw's division to join him, because he was under the impression that Bragg's orders were to use the entire corps. But as we know, Longstreet had no intention of committing McLaw's division. And Jenkins probably should have just said, well, I'm not going to do this, but he's obeying orders. And he also, frankly, thinks that if he gains a victory here, this might cement his position as acting division commander. So there's that rivalry going on as well. But William C. Oates thought this was a terrible idea. He said, no greater remissness in a general was ever exhibited, and Longstreet exhibited in allowing Jenkins to go with one division and attack two corps of the enemy. By his negligence, the lives of brave men were sacrificed. Now, of course, John White Gary is in charge of about 1,500 men at Wauhatchie. He's got two brigades, one under a man named George Cobham and one under George Sears Greene. He has 4 guns in Battery E, 1st Pennsylvania Light Artillery, a section of which was commanded by his young son, Edward Geary. Now, Geary understood that he was in a vulnerable position. So he told the men no campfires. He deploys the 29th Pennsylvania as pickets around his position. And he thinks that if the bad guys attack him, they're going to come down the mountain and hit him from the east. So down at the bottom here, a few minutes after midnight, Bratton makes his attack. But instead of making his major attack from the east, like Geary thought he would, he attacks from the north. And this completely surprises the Federals. A soldier in the 149th New York wrote that the night was still and chilly, and the men, roused suddenly from coveted sleep, were dazed and trembled from chilliness and the nervous strain induced by the unexpected situation. We were thoroughly surprised and unprepared for an enemy whose presence we could not divine. Geary responds well. He shifts his brigade around to face the new threat coming from the north. Bratton orders a volley to be fired, and that volley hits General Greene in the jaw, shatters his jaw, goes through his cheek, and knocks him out of commission. A man named David Ireland, if you're going to go to Little Round Top, and Culp's Hill, I mean, you're going to learn about all these guys. That's Greene's brigade. So Ireland is now in charge of the brigade. Bratton is trying to find Geary's right flank while attacking frontally with most of his brigade, who reached within 200 yards of the Federal position. Bratton shouts to his men, "Shoot the artillerists, shoot the cannoneers." And 22 of the 48 artillerists in Knapp's battery are shot down, including the battery commander, Charles Atwell, who's mortally wounded, and Lieutenant Geary, John White Geary's son, shot between the eyes and killed instantly. Now, as you can imagine, a firefight in the night is confused. I'm not going to get involved deeply in the tactics here, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of lead exchanged, and by about 3 o'clock in the morning, after 2 hours of fighting, Geary's men are about out of ammunition. And Geary tells them, "Fix bayonets, and we're going to hold the position with the bayonet." That's how desperate it is. And just as Bratton is about ready to launch a final assault, word comes from Jenkins to withdraw. And why? Because they're threatened from the north. A group of men are coming down from the north. And of course, that's going to be Howard's men. Now, Howard and Hooker hear the fighting at Wauhatchie, 3 miles away. And Hooker gets excited and tells Carl Schurz, "Go down there and rescue Geary." But the orders are confused, and Schurz isn't sure what he's supposed to do. Hooker is giving him conflicting instructions, and that means that Howard's other brigade, see if I can get it, it's not happening here. Can you advance it?
I'll give it a try.
Not all that critical, but we got frozen anyway. He advances the lead brigade of von Steinwehr's division under a man named Orland Smith. Orland Smith dies in Chicago, 1903. And Smith, I wish I could get a map up here, but Smith is moving south towards Wauhatchie, and he comes under fire from some high ground off to his left, off to the east. And this, of course, is Law and Robertson firing at him. And so Smith halts. One of Hooker's aides who's traveling with Orland Smith's brigade tells him, "Attack." And so Smith will turn the 33rd Massachusetts and the 73rd Ohio, his old regiment, and they will attack this high ground that today is known as Smith's Hill. Wow, now we're working. Let's see if my clicker works. There's
I did.
Colonel Smith right there. And let me get the map up here if I can. So there is a very spirited attack up here at a place that is now known as Smith's Hill. And again, I won't burden you with the tactics. There are at least 3 different charges up the hill. And there are significant casualties up there. But as that fighting is continuing, one of Schurz's brigades has passed Smith's Hill, and that is the brigade of Hector Tyndale. Tyndale's moving down the road, and he gets fired on from a hill occupied by Benning's brigade, and that is today known as Tyndale's Hill. And again, if you can visualize your trip into Chattanooga on I-24, you may remember seeing a Civil War monument rising out of the ground just to the right of the interstate. What in the world is that monument? Well, that's the monument to the fighting at Tyndale Hill. And while this fighting is going on, Jenkins sends orders to Law and to Benning to withdraw because Bratton's attack has been unsuccessful. So by 4 o'clock in the morning, on October 29th, all the Confederates have retreated back across Lookout Creek and back up in Lookout Mountain. Now, 2 companies of cavalry, the only cavalry that Booker had really there was a battalion of the 5th Alabama Cavalry and a battalion of the 1st Tennessee Cavalry. And as you know, some of the Western Theater Southerners joined the Union Army. And these were 2 battalions of Western Southerners that were with Booker's army. And they accompanied General Howard down to Wauhatchie just before dawn. And Howard writes that Geary was astonished to see me suddenly appear at his side with the smoke of battle hanging in the air. And I was surprised to find that as he grasped my hand, he trembled with emotion. Without a word, he pointed down, and I saw his son lay at his feet, killed by his father's side while commanding his battery in this action. Now, Geary would lose 216 men at Wauhatchie. Bratton lost 356. Law and Robertson suffered about 52 casualties. And Orland Smith's brigade lost about 150 men. So this fighting at Wauhatchie in 2 different locations simultaneously cost about 800 casualties. Now that's pretty small battle by Civil War standards, but it had tremendous repercussions. So the victory at Brown's Ferry and Longstreet's failure in the night attack at Wauhatchie allowed supplies to flow into Chattanooga. And the soldiers called it the Cracker Line, as you know. And Grant was treated as a hero in the Army. One soldier wrote that it had convinced us all that in Grant, the nation had found an extraordinary military chief. So what? Well, at this point, is there any reason for Bragg to stay in Chattanooga? What is his strategy? To starve the Federals out of the city. Well, that's moot. And so I would contend that Bragg should have withdrawn from Lookout, withdrawn from Missionary Ridge, perhaps gone 25 miles south behind Rocky Face Ridge, closer to his supply base at Atlanta, and lived to fight another day. But as we know, Bragg stayed, involved more with managing the discontent in his army than doing any kind of strategy. And of course, William Tecumseh Sherman arrives in mid-November with 3 divisions from the Army of the Tennessee. On November 23rd, the Federals captured Orchard Knob. The 24th, they conquered Lookout Mountain. And on November 25th, they administer the death blow to the Army of Tennessee at Missionary Ridge. The stage was now south for Grant to become General-in-Chief, for Sherman to begin planning the Atlanta campaign, and for Braxton Bragg, who at last be removed from command of Tennessee. And all of those major results were the product of these little battles at Brown's Ferry and Wauhatchie. Thanks so much for inviting me back.
You have time for a couple questions?
Well, if we had time for that book raffle, I have time for questions. It's more important on the book raffle. If they're available.
Wasn't Grant really kind of superfluous to Thomas and the Army or Cumberland? In terms of if Grant had not been doing much of anything, or saying, yes, you're confirmed as the general in charge here, or Walden Smith had already done the plan. It was Thomas's pontooners and it was Thomas's engineers. Sort of like at Lookout Mountain, what the hell the Triple Sherman do? I mean, they get all the credit there, but it seems like all the heavy lifting was the Cumberland.
I would agree. I mean, but Grant instills confidence in the Army was lacking under Rosecrans' command at that point. But I would agree with you that who's Grant's favorite subordinate?
Sure.
And who gets the prime responsibility on November 24th to defeat the Confederates at Missionary Ridge? Who, spoils his bed on November 25th at Missionary Ridge? Sherman. And if you go there today, it's the Sherman Reservation because the winners write the history. But it should be the Pat Claiborne Reservation. Sherman doesn't do too well, but that was Grant's boy. It was Grant's. So in a sense, I mean, from an operational standpoint, I see your point. But Grant instilled confidence in the Army, and by opening the cracker line, he gets the credit for that. And I don't think we should. I think if anything that Thomas should deserve a little more notoriety. But Thomas and Grant didn't get along that well either. So Grant, I admire Ulysses S. Grant tremendously. He's the best general the Union Army produced, but he was not infallible, and he had his enemies. If you got on his S list, you stayed on his S list. Thomas was one of those people. It's a good observation. Bruce.
Like you have read Liddell's memoirs, which seem to be centered on the fact that Liddell is in the center of every great decision, and he was always right.
What else is new?
What else is new? Yeah. You related the story about Liddell riding out and forming Bragg and nothing was happening. How much credence do you put in all the details of Liddell's story?
Well, I think that absolutely happened. That he was the one who rode over the Lookout Mountain and reported back to Bragg. I don't have any reason to doubt that account. I think that's very, very much accurate.
Well, some of the miscommunication between Hooker and Shores, and everything to do with going way back, I mean, to Chancellorsville.
Yes.
Do you think that was still had a lingering effect between the 11th Corps?
Well, if anybody heard the question, Bill Dennis points out that Hooker and the 11th Corps, General Howard, had a bad history experience at Chancellorsville. And yes, I think that was part of it. And in fact, Hooker tries to blame Schurz for not going to Geary's rescue at a timely fashion, and actually brings him up on a court. But Grant rides over the next day after Wauhatchie, and Hooker is explaining this happened. But Grant talks to other commanders, including Howard, and he figures out what is going on. Now, Hooker was another person that Grant tries to, as after Wauhatchie, Grant is committed to getting rid of Hooker, but it will take 7 months to get rid of Hooker. After Wauhatchie, Bragg is committed to getting rid of Longstreet. And it will take 1 week to get rid of Longstreet. Because as you know, Longstreet goes with 15,000 men to Knoxville. And this is another indictment against Bragg's decision to stay at Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge. His army is shrinking. And Grant's army is growing with Sherman arriving, which is another reason why in the world Bragg is there. But yes, to get back to your question, Hooker does not think much of any of those 11th Corps guys. And of course, the 12th Corps, the reason Henry Slocum is not with Geary is because Slocum refused to serve under Hooker. And the other division of the 12th Corps and Slocum were assigned to guarding the railroad between Nashville and Stevenson. Because Slocum says, I'm not serving under that son of a bitch. And so, yes, there's acrimony. And that's another thing, you know, we deal with these generals and we talk about their decisions on the field, but they all had personalities and they all had grudges and they all had people they liked. And you really need to understand those relationships in order to help you explain command decisions. All right, well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks again for everyone for coming tonight. I hope everyone has a great weekend. We'll look forward to seeing everybody in May. And to Gettysburg in 2 weeks. All right. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Very good.
Right, about Salt Creek meeting tomorrow.
Oh, okay, thank you. As a reminder, Salt Creek has their meeting tomorrow at 11. Tomorrow, Salt Creek is around 11 o'clock.
Did you get audio?
It's on.
Really, there's some feedback. So
Here.
let's see.
It sort of works. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So let's,
Do we have to leave the meeting?
yeah, here's the lead. So get that, leave the meeting here. Hey, Terry.